partnerships are very relationship driven sometimes. And when people move around or move on, sometimes that's when things are at risk. So the more you can put good processes in place, good documentation, and enable a lot of your, sales organization, a lot of your internal organization around the partnership, the better the chances that that partnership will actually thrive and survive beyond, a single individual who might be championing it. At the same time, though, you do want specific individuals to have accountability over the partnership, and you do want people to be on point to manage that relationship, because that's important as well. So it's about finding that right balance between, driving that sort of systemic governance around the partnership, but also making sure you have, a personal kind of high touch around it as well.
Welcome to M&A Science, where leading M&A practitioners share lessons learned from their experience. If you're interested in keeping up with the latest from M&A Science, visit mascience.com and subscribe to our free newsletter, where we share highlights from our interviews and invitations to events as we build the greatest community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kison Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Joining me today is Christina Ungaro. Christina Ungaro is the VP Head of Corporate Development at Wind River. Wind River is an enterprise software company focused on mission-critical edge computing applications. Today, we're going to talk about how to achieve your strategic goals outside of M&A. Christina, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks, Kison, for having me back.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to come back.
My pleasure as well.
Can we start off with a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. So great to be back here. I've been engaged in corporate development and M&A for about 18 years now. I had previous roles at IBM and Jones Lang LaSalle, and for a little over a year now have been at Wind River, which is an enterprise software company focused on edge solutions, where I oversee corporate development, which inclusive of M&A and corporate strategic alliances as well. So I'm excited to be here and talk to you about all things not M&A for the first time.
Yeah. Let's get right into it. When do you start thinking about your approach in general?
So for us, it all starts with business strategy and developing a strategic roadmap that outlines where we want to go as an organization. And it really comes down to finding that intersection point between what customers are asking for, where the market opportunity is, and what we can reasonably and feasibly deliver. So finding the intersection of those kind of three criteria. And once we have the business strategy kind of laid out, from there, we look to determine where do we have gaps and how are we going to solution those gaps and accelerate the strategy through a combination of build, buy, and partner. So very classic build, buy, partner framework. And determining, what the right path is. So there are a number of, I would say, common reasons where, why partnership might ultimately be the path to solution a lot of our gaps. And some of those reasons might be, maybe we've determined that there's a capability we want to provide that we don't want to own or don't need to own. Maybe it's not our core competency. Maybe the market is extremely competitive and dominated by incumbents. Maybe the market is commoditizing. Maybe the market is actually really early and emerging, and it's too early to pick winners. And it's a better strategy to partner with more than one rather than picking a lead horse. So those are some good valid reasons why it might make sense to partner rather than M&A. And then, of course, sometimes you want to pursue an M&A, but there just aren't good actionable candidates out there. Maybe due to incumbency, maybe due to valuation concerns, size concerns, maybe the ownership structure is complicated, so sometimes you have made the decision you do want to own, you do want to acquire, but the opportunity just isn't there right now. So that might be another reason why we decide to partner. But overall, I would say we have chosen to pursue partnership probably more than M&A. in the near term to quickly gain access to a lot more capabilities and deliver value to our customers.
Start with the strategy, have that defined. I like the part where you reference what's the customer asking for, what do you see as market opportunities, what can you actually deliver on, and then the buy versus build.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at that, is that we're looking at the space in general and starting to come to that conclusion of buy versus build, or are we starting to identify specific companies and then get a sense of buy versus build?
Yeah, I think we have to define what product or capability we're trying to deliver on, and then really the question is, do we want to own it, right? So buy and build are kind of two sides of the same coin of I need to own it. And if we decide we're going to try to build it, we've got to look at the cost to build it, the time to build it. Do we even know what we're trying to build, right? Because if we don't have customers yet, and we don't know much about that market yet, maybe we don't understand the requirements very well. Do we have the skills in-house to build it? So there's a lot that goes into that build decision. And I think companies routinely underestimate the effort that's required to build a new solution. So it's not unusual to sort of quickly pivot to, well, should we partner or acquire from there if the build option looks expensive, time intensive, or insurmountable.
Okay, and then that's when you get to that point of, well, I guess let's take an example. I don't currently offer M&A data.
Mm-hmm.
And if I wanted to create a capability to offer all these corporate development practitioners M&A data, and I decide, I'm still at the point where we don't want to build it. It's going to take years to accumulate that kind of database.
Yeah.
So do we then look at acquiring companies and start building out a list of potential targets? Or do we, at what point do we really start thinking that maybe we should partner, kind of knowing that most of these companies are going to be pretty pricey, the ones that have the better data set?
Yeah, I think you have to look at those two in parallel. Are there companies out there that you could acquire to quickly gain entry into that market? And replicating data, M&A data, is a very hard task that would require a fairly large investment, whether you buy or build. But I would look at acquisitions, but then also there are partner opportunities where you could potentially white label somebody else's data set. And is there a value added component that you can bring on top of that makes it a unique offering to your customers? So I would look at those two types of paths in parallel, a white label versus an acquire option.
And this is when you got into the other scenarios where, hey, M&A is expensive, right? If I look at it and we look at the top 3 companies in that space, they're a lot bigger than
very
we
expensive.
are. So I got that point where, hey.
And it's going to be hard to compete with them too, if you just build.
Exactly. Yeah. We have the competitiveness was the other part. I think that was the one you mentioned.
Yeah.
I know you had, if it was a market that's new and it's just generally risky because you don't know who's going to be the dominant players, take the opportunity to have multiple partnerships. Was there anything around the nature of just how competitive it is? Is that part of it, or
sure? Yeah, incumbency. Is the market already dominated by some large incumbents? So if you're trying to gain entry into that market, maybe better to partner with one of those incumbents rather than try to beat them at their own game.
And then the nothing's for sale.
Yeah, that could be.
Is that a real reason, or do you, if you really want to get in and buy something, can twist an arm and make it happen?
Well, it's not so much that nothing's for sale, but it might get back to the incumbency problem, right? The best options in the market are just too big to digest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're in that situation. What's next? Like, where do we start thinking about?
I think in your situation, take an inventory of what you have to bring to the table that somebody else maybe doesn't have or could use more of. So in M&A, and a dedicated, captive M&A audience, that's a pretty powerful asset that you can bring to bear. And then if there are other things that you can bring on top of that, combined with a data set to create something that's a little bit unique and compelling, you've got the beginnings of a win-win. a partnership.
We got complementary technology, data room, workflow
Yeah.
management.
Yep.
This is good. I'm getting the most time for value from this conversation now. Usually we make up an example, but this is better. We'll use M&A Science. So when we started looking at that, we defined that we have some of these capabilities. We've gotten this unique audience of corporate practitioners and some of the tech tools. What's next? Like, do we start approaching companies?
Yeah, start approaching companies, get to know each other, introduce your platform. It's very much a two-way co-selling type of discussion early on. Introduce your platform and your strategy, and get insight into their platform and their strategy, and then try to get a feel for the seeds of what we call a vision match. Can you start to develop a vision for success and envision a scenario down the road where both of you are really getting a lot out of this partnership? What does that look like exactly? Try to put some concrete parameters around that, and then create a path to get there. It could be joint solution development or product development, training, enablement, incentives, sales incentives potentially. So identify what you need to put in place to make that vision a reality, and make sure both parties are willing to make the investments needed to get there. Accountability and ownership from both sides is very key. And what you don't want to do is create a partnership that's dependent just on two people in each respective organization. You want something that will survive, people changing roles and reorganizations and that sort of thing. So, and developing metrics and performance indicators and a regular cadence to review the health of the partnership. I think that's all important, to kind of keep things going. The biggest risk with partnerships is that people change roles, people lose focus, things start to wither on the vine. I think that happens a lot. Or sometimes things never really get off the ground. You do some PR together initially, and there's a nice press release and a lot of good intentions, but the focus is never really there. The commitment is never really there. So that's really important from the outset, is to create that accountability and that focus and long-term commitment.
How does this happen? Is this on the first? Because a lot of what you talked about is structuring this partnership. Mm-hmm. How quickly does this unfold? Like, let's play out the first meeting, and we're starting to introduce mm-hmm. the idea that, hey, I'm reaching out. Just here's this idea. Yeah. How does it come out?
Yeah, I think, after the first get to know you meeting, chances are, if they're a much larger company, they probably have done this before, and they probably have some models already that you could even leverage, because data companies love to monetize their data, right? So they've got a lot of structures in place to monetize that data, and they may have some playbooks that they can leverage to kind of get things off the ground quickly. So after the introductory phase, start to sketch out what this partnership could look like, and leverage pre-existing constructs as much as you can, because that'll help accelerate things.
That makes sense. And that could come from either organization.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, let's play in our case. We don't really have any of that. We're not working off of
but I bet the companies you're talking to do. So
okay.
Yeah.
And now let's just say we for the fundamental sake, if we didn't have that, there may be a little bit more work and clarity around that. I guess the overall picture of how the firms would work together. But tell me more about the vision part. How do you relay that?
Yeah, I think it's understanding first what you're looking to get out of the relationship. What capability are you looking to bring to your customers? What kind of unique positioning in the market do you have? What kind of unique audience do you have? So you have to understand your assets first. And then, can this partner potentially layer into that and create something new and valuable to your customers? So that's where it starts. It's really understanding your market, your customers, and the solution that you're trying to build, and where this potential partner could fit into that. But yeah, it is a bit of an iterative process. Really, structuring that win-win scenario, because you're going to go into it initially focused on your side of it, but you really have to sort of continually put yourself on both sides of the table to try to get to mutual outcome.
So you're building the vision around here's what you're trying to achieve for your customers and how the capabilities would be able to accomplish that, what that would look like. And then you get the agreement on the other side. They sort of see the same thing. This makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
How's this compared to doing M&A? I mean, is this?
It's very gray. So yeah, I think M&A is a lot more black and white. You already know, the outcome is going to be go, no go. And you going through diligence and assessing technical and product fit and culture fit becomes, fairly programmatic after a while. But with a partnership, it's a completely different can of worms. There's no predetermined outcome. The outcome might change, continuously over time. And so it takes a lot more, it takes a much deeper understanding of your business and their business, and understanding, how to get synergies out of the relationship without having control over each other's assets. So, it can be pretty tricky, and it can be pretty gray. And you have to work a little harder to kind of create that vision match and create those metrics and those outputs that you're looking to achieve. It's not predefined. So when you go into it from the outset, it's very open-ended, and it's trying to translate, a lot of sort of ambiguous conversations into a very specific outcome ultimately. That's yours for the shaping. So
You're making it sound harder than acquisition.
it can be. I think when you do them over and over again, though, like M&A, it becomes a little more programmatic, and you develop some playbooks. And companies that have, data or software, they get pretty good at entering into reseller agreements and OEM agreements and things like that over and over again. So it can become more programmatic over time. But if you're doing it for the first time, it can be a little bit daunting. I would agree.
Well, let's other components on structure. We got a vision alignment. You mentioned is it building what does it entail? Like the goals or the deliverables?
Deliverables, yep. In your case, you're trying to, I assume, bring a M&A data offering to your user base, and
Correct.
I assume you want to try to monetize that in some fashion. We're not all working for free, right? So, what does that offering look like? How do you plan to monetize that? And how does it create real revenue growth for both you and the partner? Ultimately, it has to come down to value, right? We have to define how value is going to get created, how you're going to measure that value.
So there's the business model that gets clarity.
Mm-hmm.
That here's what we're going to do, offer this to the customers, and a upsell and a subscription. We're selling at $30,000. Let's make it a $12,000 add-on or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And then, so I'm clarifying. Here's the business model. What about the go-to-market? That there is a lot of moving parts to get
Mm-hmm.
this out there. Is that stuff that comes later, or?
Yeah, I think it could come at any point in the process, but it's important to define how you're going to sell this solution. So are you simply selling a partner solution to your customer base, or are you actually creating a new offering, and who's going to sell that? And, so that's, I think, defining where the M&A Science or deal room sellers come in, and what are they taking to market? Is the partner involved in the go-to-market as well? Putting the right sales incentives and training in place to make that happen. So, all of that needs to be kind of thought through, and the solution itself will help guide that. Which party is best positioned to kind of lead. But yeah, right. Go-to-market is an important element for sure. And there's no right or wrong point in the process when that should be addressed. I think it naturally starts to flow once the partnership starts to take shape.
Okay, because there might be some opportunities where here combined, this becomes a unique offering that may warrant more of a cross-sell type of opportunity, mm-hmm. or for both organizations.
Yeah, the important thing is it has to be worthwhile for the sales organization. So, as a salesperson, if you can sell your own subscriptions for $100,000 a pop, or you can get a slice of this other thing at $10,000 a pop, there's not great alignment there. So you always have to put yourself in the shoes of the sellers. What's going to get them motivated?
Have you seen something there where it typically should be similar size solutions for it to work out well, or even bigger? What's ideal?
Similar size helps, but if it's not a similar size, is it an easy add-on or an easy sale? So it's okay if it's small, as long as it doesn't take up an undue amount of the salesperson's time relative to other opportunities. So if it's a simple add-on, then that's a little bit easier.
Okay, so there's friction to sell the solution. Metrics. What kind of metrics do you build around this to know? And I guess, when does that come in play too?
Yeah, I mean, I think the metrics aren't going to yield anything until things are really up and running. So, it could partnerships take a little longer sometimes to yield results in an M&A, which is more overnight. So it might be 6, 12, 18 months out. But it really depends on what the outcome and goals of the partnership are. But you can track things like, partner-related revenue and profit, or joint customer wins. It really depends on what, how you've structured your success factors from the beginning.
Do you have separate metrics between, here's our internal measurement to measure if this partnership's successful, versus here's some joint metrics?
Yeah, I think you have to figure out what you can measure without putting undue burden on the business. So that's important to figure out up front. And taking into account what, the systems that you have in place and that sort of thing. So just like an M&A as well, we love to measure synergies, but you have to be able to measure them. If everybody's doing a lot of, financial gymnastics to get to certain numbers every quarter, that's not going to be a good use of people's time. So you want to make sure you have the systems and infrastructure in place to get those metrics and outputs, fairly easily.
Is it usually just revenues, or are there other metrics you really lock in?
There could be other metrics like joint customer wins or pipeline activity. If things are early, pipeline could be an indicator, or pipeline or backlog. So there could be other things at play. If you're doing, I've worked on some partnerships that are more focused around joint solution development, and potentially even patents can be a measurement, point of measurement if you're creating new IP together, through a joint venture or partnership. So it just, it just depends on what the outputs of the partnership are.
The people part. You mentioned that the biggest risk is the people when it comes to partnerships.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think it's natural for, in a lot of organizations, for business leaders to lead partnership activities as a way to accelerate their own business lines and their P&Ls. And then, and partnerships are very relationship driven sometimes. And when people move around or move on, sometimes that's when things are at risk. So the more you can put good processes in place, good documentation, and enable a lot of your, sales organization, a lot of your internal organization around the partnership, the better the chances that partnership will actually thrive and survive beyond, a single individual who might be championing it. At the same time, though, you do want specific individuals to have accountability over the partnership, and you do want people to be on point to manage that relationship, because that's important as well. So it's about finding that right balance between, driving that sort of systemic governance around the partnership, but also making sure you have, a personal kind of high touch around it as well. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah. I think the reverse, like unpacking the enablement of this maybe could help get a sense of how do you actually make that happen, set up that governance and keep those people aligned.
Yeah. I mean, we have alliance managers dedicated to all of our important strategic partnerships, and if somebody moves on, someone else has to take on that that account, so to speak, just like a sales model. So it's very similar to an account rep model in a sales organization. And so there's always coverage, so that never drops. And we might do quarterly or annual reviews with the partners, to kind of review, a little bit of a state of the union, to review the health of the partnership, activities that we've been engaged in together over the last quarter or the last year. Having a cadence like that in place also helps keep people, focused and on track, and make sure things don't just kind of wither.
So there's a team to keep the relationships with those partnerships as they evolve. Between getting the initial idea, starting to shape it, I guess, what are the steps to get us to like a formal partnership agreement? And then I take it that gets handed off to the team that takes on the relationship from there.
Yeah, similar to an M&A, it's agreeing conceptually to the right, sort of high level terms and parameters that you want the partnership to reflect, and then translating that into a legal document. So, we do have partnership agreements, and partnership agreements can come in a lot of different flavors. They could be a teaming agreement. It could be a reseller agreement. There's a lot of different forms that can take that most contract attorneys are very familiar with. And these are the agreements you probably see in an M&A when you're going through the diligence process. You review lots of these agreements as well. But you do have to translate into paper at some point and start to get it documented. And that starts to look very similar to an M&A process in terms of, a little bit of redlining back and forth and getting things documented to reflect the way you want the partnership to work. So that is, and then from there, similar to an M&A integration, there's a partnership sort of integration phase, so to speak, which is really enablement. It's if there's joint solution development, it's getting your respective development teams connected and developing the roadmap, as they would for any new product, developing a joint solution roadmap and executing against that. And if there's a go-to-market component, making sure that you're doing the right training and enablement with your sales force and putting the right incentives in place to make things happen. So there's definitely a negotiation, a structuring phase, a negotiation phase, and then an execution and operationalizing phase that's very similar to what you might see with an acquisition. But with an acquisition, you close on the acquisition, you integrate it, you have full control. With a partnership, you don't have full control. So those are kind of the key, and there is no sort of endpoint. You've got to continue to make it work every quarter, every year, and at some point it might not work, right? But those are kind of the key differences, I would say, process-wise and timeline-wise, between an acquisition and a partnership.
What's the time frame you typically see compared to M&A for doing a partnership?
Oh, it's all over the map. So I've worked on some partnerships that are based on a repeatable model, maybe that we've already done before. So those can happen very quickly in a matter of weeks. And in other cases, you're working sort of on that vision match for a long time, because there's a lot of churn, and there's a lot of hey, I think there's something here, but you can't quite put your finger on it yet. And so sometimes it does take a long time to structure, those outcomes that you're looking for. So it can be weeks to months or years, but I suppose M&A can be the same. I've worked on deals as well that can be months or years in some cases. So there are some similarities in that regard.
What's the difference between strategic and organic partnerships?
So I would say organic partnerships, in my definition, are very foundational to doing business, and don't have the strategic elements that a strategic partnership would have. And what I mean by that specifically is, let's take the software industry as an example. It's important that your product, if you're going to market with software, is interoperable with other products. So your application has to work with different operating systems. If you're developing an app, you want to make sure it works with Android and Apple, and you're going to have to sign a base agreement with Android or Apple. You need to make sure it works with other middleware. And so that's all really just foundational kind of partner level work to make sure that you can get your product out to market. And that kind of partnership activity should be as automated and programmatic as possible, because it's sort of it's just table stakes. And so that kind of activity will be, sort of high volume but low impact, I would say. Whereas strategic partnerships are really about selecting a targeted partner that you believe together you can create value and synergies that you could not otherwise get on your own, similar to an M&A. And they can be very multidimensional. There might be joint product or solution development, joint sales, go to market, could be national, could be global. You need to kind of scope that up front. And those strategic partners will be low in terms of numbers, but very high impact. So that's how I kind of distinguish the two. We have at Wind River over 250 partners, but many of those are foundational organic partners that we need to work with on an ongoing basis just to make sure our software works with theirs and vice versa. But we're not engaged in any joint solution development or go-to-market activities with those partners. On the other hand, we have a handful of strategic partners where we are. So that's how we distinguish them.
Does that distinguish between the activity where you'd have an internal partnership sort of function versus corporate development?
It could be. In my experience, corporate development teams that are engaged in partnerships are typically focused on those high-value strategic partnerships. And the organic partnerships might be managed through a different team or through a different program. Really depends on the organization. But typically, corporate development, really only gets involved in those more kind of complex strategic alliances that require more creative deal structuring.
Got it. You mentioned a few different types of partnerships. You mentioned teaming up, reselling. What else is there?
Well, there's a whole world out there of different ways to partner. On a most extreme example, there's joint venture, which I'm not a huge fan of joint ventures because they come with a lot of complexity and governance and reporting requirements, and oftentimes you can maybe achieve the same outcome with a more virtual construct. But that's one model. There are partnerships that may come with a strategic investment along with them, where you're a shareholder, maybe you have a board seat or a board observer seat, maybe you've got some outsized influence on the roadmap or the business strategy, and that might be necessary if it's a partner that you have a very high dependency on. And then just getting back to just other structures, we've worked on IP licensing agreements. So there's all kinds of partnerships that just require licensing each other's technology or brand name or whatever the case may be. So lots of different types of licensing agreements, royalty agreements, sell through, sell with, teaming, reseller, white label. There's a whole host of different models out there that, and it will depend on what industry you're in and what industry you're in and what kind of products you're selling.
So there is a lot of different ones. When you said joint ventures, your favorite, you have minority investment. Well, I looked at partnerships with investment as essentially minority investment. You'd separate them. You'd say, hey, here's a company. Maybe we did like a corporate venturing. You make a minority investment. But in this case, is those parameters of doing a partnership, but you're also making an investment and taking a similar small bite of the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just depends on what your strategy is. If you've got a corporate venture capital arm, you obviously you're going to have capital deploy broadly, and you might not be partnered at all with many of those companies. You might just be, looking to sort of support that ecosystem for whatever reason. But most strategic corporate strategics, I would say, do, true minority investing, with specific intent and very specific reasons, and there's usually a partnership tied to it. Otherwise, shareholders generally don't like to see, corporates deploying money into just investments just for economic reasons. There should be some strategic element to it that furthers the business.
The different models when you say sell through, sell with, so it seems like it could be distribution could be on either side or both sides.
Could be, yeah. I mean, in your case, if you partnered with a data provider, you could potentially just make that data offering available to your customers as its own product. So, essentially they are selling through you as a channel. If it's a sell with, it's more of a joint go-to-market motion, and that's typically what you see in like larger enterprise-focused businesses, where you're going to large Fortune 100 companies with complex solutions. You might have a few different people at the table selling together, so that's kind of more of a sell with motion. So yeah, it depends on the situation.
Okay, so but it's all open.
It's all
I can
open.
sell on either side. I can, like you said, do joint selling. Yeah. Okay, and then let's talk about joint ventures more.
Yeah.
Why opt out of a joint venture over partnerships? Or why would you opt for a joint venture over a partnership?
Why for a joint venture? So I think there are, select situations where a joint venture can make sense. In my opinion, if you're creating something new, and both parties have something very distinct and unique to bring to the venture, and there's limited friction with your existing business, and you want to create a new brand and all that sort of thing, it can make sense in those situations. But then when you have other situations where two parties are contributing maybe existing assets, existing people, existing contracts, it gets a little bit messy, kind of disentangling that from your existing business. And then, layering all the governance and reporting on top of that, those can get a little bit hairy. So it really just depends on what the nature of the joint venture is. But if you're going to go down that path, it can be an expensive and cumbersome path. So there have to be really good reasons for why you're going down that path. And then the other thing to think about is I've always likened to joint ventures to entering into a marriage that is going to end in a divorce at some point. Because very rarely do joint ventures just exist into perpetuity. So you end up spending a lot of your time negotiating exit terms up front, and down the road, it's going to be a situation where either you're fighting over the asset or you're both fighting to, it's a hot potato and neither of you wants it at all. So that can be a lot of, taxing on resources and time, sort of working through those exit terms. And so I think you just have to really kind of some people jump to joint venture immediately as a construct, but I think it's important to just take a step back and try to figure out, what are we trying to accomplish? And are there other ways we can accomplish this without going down the path of actually creating a new legal entity, which comes with a whole other set of obligations around it that shouldn't be taken lightly.
It seems like joint ventures are common in some industries over others. Do you see it in software as much?
We don't see it as much in software. And I think maybe some of that has to do with the fact that there's so much intellectual property, at stake in the software industry. And it's hard to sort of divide that in half when you're talking about a joint venture and who has rights to what and that sort of thing. But then, of course, you go to certain markets like China, where China's been a huge proponent of the joint venture model, for various reasons, and many companies had good and bad experiences with that. So, it depends on the industry and it depends on the market too. There are certainly some geographic markets that will lend themselves more to a joint venture structure. And then I've seen it over the course of my career in the defense, the government and defense sector as well, where the government actually has a program called its Mentor Protege program, where they actually encourage companies to team up, big and small companies to team up together in a joint venture to deliver solutions. And they do that as a very deliberate way to have access to innovative cutting edge technology from the small company with a larger company on top of it to de-risk it. That's a model the government really likes. And, so you see a lot of companies that play in that space, forming these joint ventures that are specifically around a government contract. So there's all sorts of unique situations where a joint venture might be the right path or simply necessary to actually winning the contract. But my preference is to only go down that path, as a last resort.
Sounds like don't jump right to it and get joint venture happy.
Yeah.
What about minority investments? When do you start thinking about minority investments?
So I think as a corporate strategic, and putting aside for the moment corporate venture capital arms, because we're not talking about that, but a true minority investment, I've only used them sparingly, and it can be a good solution when you're in a strategic partnership and you've got a lot of dependency on that partner and you're worried about certain things, like maybe are they going to get acquired, or what if they change business direction or whatnot. So where in situations where you're creating a healthy dependency on a partner, a minority investment might make sense as a way to demonstrate your long-term commitment to the partner. That might be important to them, as a way to get access to certain rights that you otherwise wouldn't have, such as information rights, a board observer seat, M&A notification rights. It's rare to get sort of a right of first refusal, but you can always ask for that. Sometimes you do get that, and just generally have more of a seat at the table and more influence over their product roadmap or their business strategy, which, so all of those things might be important if you're very dependent on that partner.
And so those little incentives are what drive you to start thinking about that. Who usually brings it up? Is that something you would bring up and sort of?
Yeah, I think if you can achieve a lot of those things without the investment, that's always preferable. But typically the company, if it's a startup or kind of a mid-stage startup, they might be going through a funding round, and they might bring it up. They like having corporate strategics. As a startup, that having VCs on your cap table and corporate strategics brings their unique pros and cons. So I've talked to some startups that actually would prefer to have more corporate strategics on their cap table, because they bring synergies and they bring market access, and they bring a level of partnership sometimes that they can't get from the VCs that they've been working with. So it just depends on what the company is looking for, but oftentimes they bring it up proactively if they're going through a funding round.
Okay. I've had it on the other side where we've had some key accounts and they've brought that up, if there's warrants and so forth, that they could.
Yeah.
But I don't like that.
Yeah. Sometimes, sometimes I've done warrants that are performance based. So it can drive a certain level of commitment and focus, maybe.
That would be interesting. If
especially when you're talking about a large company partnering with a small company, and the small company is worried about being one of 100 partners in the large company's program. So how do we get elevated as a partner, and get more airtime? And warrants could potentially be a way to do that.
What would that look like? Give me an example of a structure for warrants.
They could be. I've done warrants that convert based on mutual revenue achievement. So they're usually tied to revenue or some other concrete performance indicator, and at that point the warrants vest. But they're not. As with any warrants, they're not liquid until there's a liquidity event.
Okay.
Yeah.
That could be a good option. I like that.
Yeah, it's a fairly benign way to, because for the company, giving the warrants don't really mess with your cap table too much until the liquidity event happens. So it can and if they're tied to performance, well, that can be a win-win. So they can be a fairly effective and benign way to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for if you're a startup.
So the small company, here's an incentive with one of the larger companies to do a partnership. I would offer warrants and saying, hey, here's an incentive that we could provide. And the revenue achievement, I guess it all goes back to that earlier point of it depends how we're distributing and what the expectations are built in the partnership.
Yeah.
Going back to the minority investments, can you teach me how to negotiate those first right of refusals?
I haven't been very successful at it myself, and I wouldn't recommend that anybody agree to it. So I unfortunately I don't have any tips there other than it doesn't hurt to ask.
That would be a court dev's job a little too easy. Just get these foot in the door in a bunch of deals.
Yeah. Obviously, the more money you have at stake, the more sway you might have in getting that type of a term. But
that's true. Do you take a bigger bite?
Yeah.
Just something I'm curious about that may not be is going to give me, I know, what kind of response in terms of it depends. When I think about these margins around these partnerships, is there like ranges, even software side particularly? Obviously, every industry changes, but is there something around that to wrap your head around between, we're taking your solution and selling it to our client base or vice versa? That's sort of a range or any guidance on that?
In terms of the pricing model around that?
Yeah. On the business model side, to get a sense of, hey, how do you sort of at least come in the gate with some consideration of this would be enticing for both sides?
Yeah, I mean, and it does depend. And of course, software licensing in general has a high range of variability around it because every company has a list price and then engages in a healthy amount of discounting on a routine basis. So it's hard to say where the starting point is. But I think as a software reseller, the resale partner might be able to earn, anywhere from 10, 20, 30%, kind of margin on reselling software. So you're not going to get the 80, 90% margins that, that the partner is able to get through a firsthand sale. But as a reseller, you can sometimes make pretty decent margins reselling those. And for the partner, they're still getting a healthy cut, and they're not paying instead of paying a commission, they're paying to a reseller partner instead. So most software companies have pretty well-defined multi-dimensional channel strategy that will have a direct sales component, a reseller channel, and then maybe some other partner channels.
And then I got to figure out our go-to-market and incentivizing our sales reps within that margin range.
Yeah.
Which doesn't leave much left after that.
Yeah, well, if the software costs $100 and you guys are buying it from the partner at 70 and selling it for 100 and you're making 30 off of it, then you need to figure out, how much of that 30 are you going to share with your software sellers?
Yeah, because that keeps that whole thing of how do you keep them from the other objects that.
Yeah, there is a business case around it. And how do you get your sellers, excited about selling this versus everything else they have on the truck?
Yeah, because they're big items that they're getting 10 to 20% on.
Yeah.
Then when that's said and done, I'm like, rather they focus on our own products.
Right. Yeah. Well, they're gonna, like any good salesperson, they're gonna focus on selling the big ticket items first, and then the next thing is they're gonna sell whatever sells quickest. So it's and that might not be the biggest ticket item. So,
but it still might be additive if it's that friction to sale isn't so strong that they can do a quick little checkbox and add it in there.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious about the partnerships I've worked on is what I'm curious about, to be honest with you, since we've been using our company's example. But the stuff that doesn't work, I feel like there's a lot of times you do these partnerships, you have a lot of conversations, you get to the point where you, even with a good vision,
Mm-hmm.
you get an agreement finally signed, crickets, like nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you get the introduction, the different marketing folks are talking, the sales teams are talking,
Mm-hmm.
nothing happens. I don't know. Have you been in that situation? What do you do to make sure that doesn't happen?
Sure. I mean, it happens all the time. I think it could be that the joint solution is not well defined, or there isn't enough value add there. It could be that customers, you misjudge the customer demand or the way customers want to consume. So or it could just be a function of lack of internal focus and just that incentive misalignment. So there's a lot of reasons why it happens. It does happen all the time. But it's just got to sort of dissect why that is and try to execute the next one better. Sometimes also the one partner starts to maybe change directions, or the partners end up eventually competing with each other, based on the trajectories they're each going in, and that can bring friction down the road as well. Or maybe one partner makes an acquisition that suddenly, puts them into misalignment or competition with the partner. So, all sorts of things can happen to kind of derail that. But in my experience, the two biggest issues have been either the joint value proposition, which is never well defined from the beginning, or it's a sales issue, a sales enablement issue, and the sales force just isn't focused on it because it's too small or too hard to sell relative to everything else that they've already got.
That's what I ran into, is more of the enablement component. Are there any things that you could do to help get off on the right start?
I think if what you're creating is a very unique joint solution, and it has to be meaningful enough, you could put dedicated sellers around that potentially, and that would help alleviate some of that friction within the sales force. So, but obviously it needs to be a meaningful enough solution on its own to justify that, and you've got to put a business case around that. But having dedicated sellers around can help. Or it might be a solution that doesn't require any direct sales. Maybe it's something you're selling through a marketplace, or more of a passive sales channel or an e-commerce channel. And in those cases, you wouldn't have those issues. Then it becomes a function of effective marketing.
What if there's a company you want to buy because it's worth it?
Yeah.
They don't want to sell. Would you sort of use this partnership to kind of get a little dating relationship going?
Sure. Sort of a try before you buy strategy. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would say if you talk to any strategic acquirer, I can guarantee you some percentage of their historical M&A has come through they were partners first. So I think it's a very common pathway to partner first with a company before you acquire them. And you'll learn a lot about that, about them, about their product, their culture fit, synergy potential. You'll learn a lot about all of that before going down the acquisition path. And if they're reluctant to sell, there obviously must be good reasons for that. But forging a successful partnership could bring them around eventually. And things change down the road. So, I think that's a good strategy overall. We call it try before you buy. And it has definitely been effective in the past. I mean, I've been in many situations where the company I was acquiring was a partner, in some cases a company that we were invested in.
I like that. Then the timing could fit better down the road as well for their
Yeah,
considerations?
sometimes the timing's just not right now, but things may change in the future. And some of that might have to do with where you each are in your maturity cycle. It might have to do just with people who are at the helm, that that can heavily impact things as well sometimes.
Any other advice that we didn't touch on that you'd have for me on structuring partnerships?
Um, I think we covered a lot of ground here,
We did.
son. Yeah.
It's my job.
Yeah.
Get as much as
The
I
only
can.
advice I would say is that there are some very distinct differences between partnerships and M&A. And one thing that I have found personally is that sometimes M&A can be very procedural in some ways, and partnerships, they are a lot grayer, as we discussed, and you do need to have a much deeper understanding of the underlying business. And so, getting people on your team to work partnerships, it's great to bring those people in from other parts of the organization. Corp dev, people typically draw from finance or strategy. From partnerships, though, you kind of want to draw from sales or support or some other areas of the organization, people who've been sort of deeper in the trenches and really know the business, because they might have a very fresh perspective to bring in structuring the partnership. So it does require, there's some commonality in the skill set between partnerships and M&A, but there's also some unique differences. And I think if you're putting together a partnerships team, it does require a little bit more of that sales and business development experience and background compared to your classic kind of finance banker backgrounds that you get in corp dev.
That's a really great tip and perspective on putting that consideration in, so I don't screw up the next partnership we work on.
Yeah.
Christina, what's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
The craziest thing I've seen in M&A, he said, I'd have to say, I'm watching it right now. This Twitter Elon Musk saga. It's probably one of the crazier things I've seen in recent memory. We could talk about that all day long. But,
I think it's the media is bored and needs something to, if it wasn't Elon, it wouldn't be covered.
no, it wouldn't. But I think there's a lot of good lessons learned coming out of that situation in real time. And for me, it's do your diligence and don't rush into things hastily. Certainly don't buy things for political reasons. And I think when you acquire businesses and value businesses based on the underlying fundamentals, irrespective of sort of what's going on in the market, then you'll never have buyer's remorse, right? The market can move around. The market's going to move around every day, every month. But if your valuation is really tied to underlying fundamentals and sound principles, that doesn't move around as much. So I think we've seen a lot of buyer's remorse in this tech market over the last 6 months, and people who are valuing things based on market multiples are the ones who are having the biggest regrets right now.
Yeah, sounds like there's a lot of opportunity ahead for you if the market keeps holding up this way.
I hope so. My 401k is not doing as well, but
I know.
But yeah, hopefully, I think all strategic acquirers are hoping this will be a good buying opportunity, but we'll see.
Christina, thanks for hanging out with me today.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for helping me be a better M&A scientist.
Thank you, Kison. It's my pleasure.
Cheers. Here's to the deal.
Thank you.